Good afternoon, everyone. This is Leanne Bryan from the Subsidy Center. We're going to get started in just another minute. We see folks are still joining the room. Looks like we have about 27 so far, but we're going to just give a few more seconds to see if other folks join. I see a lot of familiar names on the list. Welcome to the next error rate call. I know you guys are chuckling at your seats. It's okay. All right, we've only had one other attendee join, so I'm going to go ahead and get us started. Welcome to our Year 2 cohort call, Creating the Sampling Decisions, Assurances, and Fieldwork Preparation Plan, and the Customized Record Review Worksheet. So we're going to get the acronyms out of the way right from the start. The Sampling Decisions, Assurances, and Fieldwork Prep Plan, for anyone on this call who might be new to the process, that's the SDAP. The Record Review Worksheet, we refer to that as the RRW. Just a couple housekeeping notes before we dig in. Katie did send the slides out this afternoon, so if you were registered for the webinar as of about an hour ago, you should have received the slides. Also, in our handouts box within the GoToWebinar dashboard, there are 4 handouts that are available. Please feel free to download those, and we'll also be referencing them throughout the webinar. Those handouts are the data collection instructions, the OLDC request form for anyone who doesn't have access and needs it, as well as a handout on navigating the OLDC or online data collection instructions. So your presenters this afternoon, we'll have Janae Broadway. She's the error rate specialist for Region 7. So on today's call, that would be Iowa. And that's me in the middle, Leanne Bryan. I'm the error rate specialist for Region 1. So hello to my friends in Rhode Island and Massachusetts. And for every other state on the call today, your error rate lead or error rate specialist is Katie Watts. We like to show this map just as a reminder of who all of our Year 2 states are. As many of you are looking through the attendee list, you probably see a lot of familiar names. When we have these cohort calls, we group you all by your cohort. So this group of folks is who you are joining webinars with year after year. So feel free to reach out to each other, share any strategies, make contacts. There are 17 states in Year 2. Several of which have already begun the error rate process. I know Rhode Island and South Dakota, you're getting ready to start reviews if you haven't already. And also Arkansas, Utah, and Oregon, you're all gearing up, having submitted either your SDAP or both your SDAP and the Record Review Worksheet. One more note before I turn it over to Janae is we really do encourage questions, discussion. If you have a question, you can raise your hand using the GoToWebinar dashboard, and we'll call on you so you can ask your question or open things up for discussion. And we also have the questions box, so you can type your questions in. One more note in introductions, I failed to introduce our OCC partners. So from OCC, the Office of Child Care Central Office, I see Adi Fator is on the line, so thank you, Adi, for joining us. Linda Winings is likely sitting with Adi in a huddle room, or maybe Linda will be joining in a few more minutes. So Janae, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you to walk through the agenda. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, Leanne. So let's go through today's agenda. First, we'll give a basic overview regarding the error rate process. Then we will walk through creating the Sampling Decisions, Assurance, and Fieldwork Preparation Plan, or as Leanne stated earlier, the SDAP. And then we'll spend some time on how to customize the Record Review Worksheet. Now afterwards, we'll wrap up the webinar by discussing next steps. So let's get started with the error rate review, the error rate overview. Excuse me. So the error rate review focuses on eligibility errors and improper payments in the state CCDF program. Reviewers from the state lead agency will examine a random sample of 276 case records for eligibility errors and will report on various measures that will report on various measures the causes of errors and improper payments and plans to reduce future errors. Now, each of the 50 states plus Puerto Rico and District of Columbia conduct the review once every 3 years on a rotational cycle. There are 3 cohorts of states. You are all, as Leanne stated, year 2 states. And you will be reporting on your errors in June of 2021. The report will be based on case records from October 1st, 2019 through September 30th, 2020, which is referred to as your review period. So we're currently in the midst of your case record review period. So let's look at a more condensed version of the case review steps here. There are 6 steps in completing the error rate review process. The first step is to learn about the process by reading the data collections instructions, which we refer to as the DCI. The DCI includes all the templates for the different submissions and instructions for completing the submissions, sampling cases, and conducting reviews. Now, the DCI was emailed out with the slides to most of you, as she stated, who registered at least an hour prior to, but is also available in the handout box in the GoToWebinar interface. Now, once you familiarize yourself with the DCI, you'll plan for the reviews by creating and submitting the Sampling Decisions Assurance and Fieldwork Preparation Plan, tongue twister, or the SDAP. Then you'll customize the Record Review Worksheet template. Once the SDAP and the Record Review have both been created and approved, you can begin conducting your case reviews of 276 case records utilizing your approved Record Review Worksheet. And in just a moment, Katie will go over both the SDAP and the Record Review Worksheet in detail with you. But once you've completed those reviews, the next step is to report the results of the reviews in the final report, which we call the State Improper Payments Report, or the ACF 404. If you have an error or a percentage of improper payments, if you have an error rate or a percentage of improper payments that exceeds 10%, you will be required to create and complete a corrective action plan. Now, throughout each of these steps you see before you, you can receive TA support from NICSIA, and we'll hold more training webinars between now and June of 2021. Okay, so let's look at a timeline. There we go. This shows the timeline for the error rate review, including the dates of the different submissions for the year 2 states. The first line displays the case review period, which is October 1st, 2019 through September 30th, 2020. The timeline also shows the last day to submit your SDAP, which is October 31st, 2020, and the last day to submit your customized Record Review Worksheet, which is December 31st, 2020, as well as the last day to submit your final report, which is the State Improper Payments Report, which is due on June 30th, 2021, and you can submit it prior to that date. Now, again, if you're required to submit a corrective action plan, this must be submitted within 60 days from the deadline for submitting the State Improper Payments Report, or the ACF 404, and that deadline was June 30th, 2021. Do we have any questions thus far?
I'm not seeing any.
Good deal. Perfect. So let's go to creating the SDAP. This next section of the webinar is how to plan for the state reviews by creating and submitting the SDAP. Sorry. And we'll go through the SDAP. Well, we actually went through the SDAP in a previous webinar, but we're actually going to go through each step of creating it on this webinar. So let's look at an overview. The SDAP is completed, as we stated, utilizing a template. If you were around, well, actually we didn't say that. If you were around a few years ago, it wasn't utilized with a template. So this will be new to you guys. You can find that particular template in the DCI, but you have to submit the SDAP using the online data collection system or the OLDC. This is the same website that you use to submit the ACF 404 report, and you can refer to the OLDC handout for more information on accessing and navigating the OLDC system. But it's important to note that here that you cannot begin sampling the cases until the SDAP has been approved by the regional office. However, you can begin working on customizing the record review worksheet and submit that before the SDAP has been approved. Now, sometimes lead agencies will submit the SDAP and the record review worksheet at the same time, and that is acceptable. All right. So I'll turn it over to Katie here now to go through the three parts of the SDAP, which includes the sampling decisions, the assurances, and the fieldwork preparation. Katie?
Thanks, Janae. So yes, we will start with part one, the sampling decisions. And as Janae mentioned, we did go through some of the SDAP on our previous webinar, which I think was back in October. At this time, I'd like to really go into it a little bit more in depth. So we will be walking through each item in more detail. And actually, before I move on, we just got a good question in from Carol in Iowa. She asked, can the OLDC template accept text copied from a Word document? So Carol, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you're asking, can you kind of fill out your SDAP using Word and then just copy and paste your answers into the OLDC? And unfortunately, the answer to that is it depends. We've run into with the final report, the 404 report, where some states are able to copy and paste just fine, and other ones, they fill out everything for the 404 report in Word and they try to copy it and it just doesn't work. So I think we always say to use Internet Explorer, make sure that it's, up to date and everything. That's your best bet. But yeah, unfortunately, we can't give a straight answer on that because the OLDC sometimes works in mysterious ways. So yeah, hopefully you can copy and paste it, but it's not always guaranteed. So that's a good question. Thank you, Carol. So we're going to start with the first items in part one of the SDAP, and this involves the selection of cases and replacement cases. In the first item, it states that you will select 276 cases and blank monthly replacement cases. And this is asking for the number of replacement cases that you will select per month, not annually. There is some confusion around this item, I think, because, the first part of the sentence gives the annual number of cases in the main sample, 276. So sometimes I think the person that's filling out the report thinks that we're asking for the annual number of replacement cases as well. But we are looking for the monthly figure here. So you must choose at least 3, and you can choose more. Click on the box to agree that you will obtain approval from the regional office, that's what RO means, before using any replacement cases. And next, clearly describe your procedures for collecting samples, including the samples of replacement cases. And we are looking for, some detail here. Chapter 4 of the DCI can help with creating your response to this item. One thing that we ask that you're super clear about here is that the replacement cases will be drawn separately from the main sample. One B of the SDAP Part 1 asks for the name of the source of your random number generator. So this is pretty self-explanatory. Many lead agencies use the RAND function in Excel, or a function from your own online database, or even just a website that can generate a random number. All of that is fine to use here. And again, there's much more detail on choosing and using that random number in Chapter 4 of the DCI. One C includes several items about the frequency of selecting the monthly sampling frames and the projected start date. So first, select your frequency for collecting monthly sampling frames. So this isn't how often you'll be conducting reviews, but just how often you'll be selecting the cases. If you choose Other here, then you'll need to describe your plans in a comments box that will appear. Moving down, you'll give us your projected start dates for sampling and for starting your reviews. You don't need to give us a specific date like February 19th, but please give the month. So you could just say, for example, February 2020. Part 2 of the SDAP is the assurances section, and I'm not going to read all of this now, but we ask that you read it before you click on the box to agree with the assurances. So let's move into Part 3 of the SDAP, and this is the Fieldwork Preparation Plan. The first set of items, 3A, involves identifying the project leadership. So first, you'll give the names, job titles, and roles of the leadership team. And to be clear, this is only asking for those who you consider to be part of the project leadership, and not a list of everyone who will be involved with the review. So share what their roles will be in the process, and click the box to show that you agree with the statement that the leaders understand the program and can ensure that timelines are met. Moving along to the next item, give the name and job title for the person who will certify and submit that final report, the ACF 404 State Improper Payments Report. Something to keep in mind here is that the report is submitted in June. The deadline again is June 30th of 2021. And if we ask you to make any changes to the report after we've reviewed it, you may need to resubmit during the month of July. So if people from your leadership team often go on summer vacation in June or July, you will want to make sure here that at least one person will be around during that time. We usually only see one name given for this item, but it is okay to give more names if you want to indicate that more than one person will have that ability to certify and submit. Item 3B asks about inter-reviewer consistency. So share the methods that you'll use to ensure consistency amongst your reviewers. At a minimum, you must check the box for re-review of cases, this first box here. And in your description, share the types and numbers or percentage of cases that will go through a re-review. We very highly recommend that all cases with an improper payment error go through a re-review, and then at least some of your other cases. Down here, you can check boxes for other methods. If you choose a group discussion or the other box, be specific in your descriptions about how these will contribute to inter-reviewer consistency. Three C of the SDAP Part 3 asks for information on your review team. So first, give the size of the review team. And remember, this is referring only to those who will actually be conducting the case reviews. And then describe the composition. And you don't need to give names, you can, but you don't have to. But we do ask that you share a little bit of information, like where the reviewers are coming from. Are they coming from, somewhere within the lead agency or an external QC unit? And share what the duties will be, like the breakdown of who will be conducting first level reviews versus re-reviews, or will everyone be doing some of each, or so on. That's the kind of thing that you'd want to include in this composition item. And 3D deals with error definitions, and we're going to spend a little bit of time on these since we know they can sometimes cause some confusion or be a little challenging. The SDAP actually asks for 3 different error definitions. First, there's a general definition, and that encompasses, all of the errors that you might come across in this review. Next, you give a definition for improper payment errors. So in other words, eligibility errors that result in an improper payment to the provider. And finally, you'll give a definition for non-payment or administrative errors. And these are the eligibility errors that do not result in an improper payment to the provider. So what are we looking for here in error definitions? These are a few good examples of that first general error definition. I'm not going to go through each of these. Hopefully you can read them on your own time, and they might help with coming up with your own general error definition. The important thing here is that each of these definitions are kind of all-encompassing. They refer to any error that would be found in this review, regardless of whether the error results in an improper payment. I do want to take a moment to give some examples of general error definitions that might not be so good. So I'll read the first example here. An error refers to a misapplication of law, regulation, or policy governing the administration of CCDF grant funds that results in an improper payment to the provider. Let me think about that for a moment. So why isn't this a good general error definition? Because it states that the error results in an improper payment. It's not a general definition. This might be a good definition for improper payment error, but not for that general. All right, second example, and I'll read this. Any violation or misapplication of child care policies, rules, and procedures, including eligibility errors, errors in payment processing, and intentional program violations from the parent or provider. So this example is more general, but it's still not a good definition for this review because it includes things that are not under the scope of our error rate review. We only look here at eligibility errors and not errors in payment processing, for example, or intentional program violations. In this slide, we move on to some good examples of the second definition, which is for improper payment errors. And again, you can read these on your own, but one thing you will find in each of these definitions is that they specifically refer to an improper payment or over or underpayment issued to the provider. Right, so sticking with improper payment errors, in this slide I'll show some examples of definitions that would not work. So first here on the left side of your screen, I'll read this one. A violation or misapplication of policy or procedure governing the child care program that results in an incorrect authorization to the child care provider. So why isn't this a good definition? It's because of that word authorization on the last line. So we're interested in incorrect payments here, not just authorizations. So if that word authorization was changed to payment, then it would be an acceptable definition. Our next example on the bottom left. An improper payment error refers to any payment that should not have been made or a payment that was made in the incorrect amount due to miscalculation of income, miscalculation of cost share amount, or missing documentation. So in this definition, the state gave some examples of what causes an improper payment, and it's fine to do that, but this reads as if those are the only things that would lead to an improper payment. So if you do want to give examples of error causes in your definition, be clear that they are just examples and not an exhaustive list. So you could say something like, including but not limited to miscalculation of income, and so on. Also, another thing that is wrong with this definition is using missing documentation here at the end. It suggests that every instance of missing documentation would result in an improper payment, and that's usually not the case. So now we'll move on to that third definition that's required, and that is for non-payment or administrative errors. The important thing in each of these definitions, these good examples, is that they specify that the error does not result in improper payment or a change in the payment. And in this slide, I have one example of an administrative error or a non-payment error definition that would not be good. Any violation or misapplication of law, regulation, or policy governing the administration of CCDF grant funds, regardless of whether such a violation results in an improper payment. So why wouldn't this be a good definition for administrative error? This would actually be a great general error definition, but it's not clear here that this is referring to errors that do not result in an improper payment. Right, so I'm going to stop for just a moment. I don't think there's any questions about error definitions, but if you do have one, you can raise your hand. All right, seeing nothing, I'll move on to move away from the error definitions and back to the next part of the SDAP, which is 3E. And this asks for your plans for reviewing your state policies, procedures, and processes. So first, describe your plan to ensure that the customization of your Record Review Worksheet, or RRW, will use state policy in effect during the sample month. So make sure that you consider whether there were or will be any policy changes during the review period. If so, you might want to reference those here. Next, describe your plans to ensure that the reviewers will consistently interpret error. Here you might want to say something about how this will be built into your reviewer training. You can also think about your plans for ensuring ongoing inter-reviewer reliability, as you described back in section 3B. And then the last part of 3E asks you to describe how you'll identify whether to apply a pooling factor and how you'll determine what that pooling factor will be on the state improper payments report. So this is not a yes or no item. It's not just asking, are you going to use a pooling factor? Instead, share some information about whom you'll consult with for information about the pooling factor. Is there a specific person or unit that can provide this? What do you know about the pooling factor already? For example, what funds are in the pool? If you know for sure that you don't have a pooling factor in your state, again, share how you know this. And there's a note here that you don't need to give us the actual figure. All right, Jeff from Tennessee, you have your hand raised, so I'm going to unmute you. Feel free to speak up with what your question is.
Hey, thank you. This may be a goofy question, but what is a pooling factor? We have no idea.
Okay. I would actually like to turn that question over to our friends in the central office because I think they could probably describe it a lot better than I could. Adi or Linda?
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. And actually, there's even a better person than me to describe it, but she's not on this call. But generally, the idea of a pooling factor is that some states pool their funds. They don't just use one type of fund. They put several funding streams together. And so we want to know, we want to know what portion is CCDF. So that pooling factor will be the amount that's CCDF. So if your pooling factor is 98%, that means that it's 98% CCDF and 2% something else.
Gotcha. Okay, that helps a lot. We were a bit confused of what Tennessee's doing, so thank you.
No, you're very welcome. It's a good question. And if any states are interested in hearing more specifically about your state's funding streams and how you pool your funds and how you should be reporting about them, we do have a person who has more expertise in that, and she would be happy to talk with you more about it. So that's something you can reach out to us about. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Yeah, Jeff, it's not a silly question at all because it's something that comes up a lot in different states, and like I said, it's not my area of expertise, so it's something that a lot of us have questions on. So thank you. Okay. So in item 3F of the SDAP, we ask about your information systems project responsibilities. And there's a list of tasks here, and check off those that you will accomplish in partnership with IT systems and staff. If there's anything else you would like to highlight, you can check the others box at the bottom and describe. If any of the boxes above others are not checked, then here you'll describe how and by whom those tasks will be accomplished. In the last part of 3F, describe your processes to determine the annual amount of payments. So this refers to all CCDF payments that were made for all children over the sample period. Share how you'll get this figure. Do you get it from a particular person or unit, or how will you pull it from a system, and so on. And finally, the last item in the SDAP is 3G, Case Review Logistics. And this asks to share some logistical details, including whether the reviewers will be examining physical or electronic records, how the records are handled, where the reviews will take place, and how the review files will be organized and maintained. So just ensure that all of these components are included in your response. Okay. So now in this section, we'll move on to the next step in the error rate process, which is customizing the record review worksheet. Unless there are any other questions on the SDAP, but I don't see any hands raised. So I will go ahead and move on. So the record review worksheet, or again, RRW, provides a standardized worksheet to assess the case record to determine whether eligibility was determined correctly and whether there was an improper payment. Each element contains 4 columns, which each have a specific purpose. And let me show you really quickly a blank, or the blank record review worksheet template, in case you haven't seen this already. But, as I mentioned, there's a series of elements, each focusing on a different area of eligibility. And for each element, there are 4 columns, which each serve a specific purpose. The first one is to kind of lay out what the requirements are for that element. The second column is where the reviewer would conduct their analysis of the case record. The third is where the reviewer would record their findings. And the fourth is a couple of items that are coded to show the results. So there's 4 columns in each element except for element 500. That one only has 2 columns. The record review worksheet is a template, parts of which cannot be changed and parts of which are customized by the lead agency to conform to your own policies and procedures so that you can conduct your reviews based on those. States utilize a variety of formats to conduct their reviews with the record review worksheet. For example, some states use an Excel worksheet or an Access database, an online database, or even paper and pencil, and all of those are acceptable. But you must be able to provide a printed version of your record review worksheet that matches the template as found in the DCI and DCI data collection instructions. The customized record review worksheet is submitted directly to your program specialist in the regional office, so this is not submitted in the OLDC like the SDAP. And you cannot begin your reviews until the record review worksheet has been approved. So as I mentioned a couple slides back, certain portions of the record review worksheet are customized, and that is what we will be focusing on in this portion of the webinar. When creating your record review worksheet, make sure you do not remove anything from the template, with the exception of the NAs that appear in columns 2 and 3 of the template. This on the screen, it says column 3. It should actually say columns 2 and 3 here, but let me show you what I mean. So we ask that you do not change anything on this template, with the exception of, you see these boxes here that say NA in columns 2 and 3. Those should be removed. Those are actually just here for 508 compliance, and they're not considered part of the template. So those should be removed, but everything else should stay. In column 1 of elements 100 through 410 under the boilerplate, give policy citations or other requirements for the reviewers to consider when assessing the case record. And in column 2 of elements 100 through 410, customize by adding items that reviewers will complete while analyzing the case record. Do not customize anything in columns 3 or 4. Do not customize anything in the mid-table or in element 500. So a few general tips for customizing your record review worksheet. First, focus on what we call front-end eligibility errors. So we're interested in what took place during the most recent eligibility determination or redetermination, and any change reports that took place after that. So don't include items that happened on the back end, payment processing, attendance, and so on. One exception to this, there's always an exception, is that we do look at payment in element 410, and we will discuss element 410 a bit more in a few minutes. The next tip is to not include any items where the reviewer would be asked to record personally identifiable information of clients, children, or providers. And this includes things like names, birth dates, addresses, workplace names, or provider license numbers if that can be traced back to the provider. We do sometimes see on worksheets, provider number entered. If it's just an internal provider number internal to the lead agency, that's fine to include. But if it's something that anyone could just Google or do a search on your agency's website and it's tied to the provider, then that would be considered personally identifiable information. Right, so at this time, I'm going to show some examples of customizing the record review worksheet. And as I go through these, keep in mind that, again, they're just examples, and your own state's customizations will look different based on your policies and specific requirements for eligibility. So let's start with element 100. This slide shows the template for element 100. It's blank, there's no customization yet. On the top left corner, you can see the boilerplate. So you can see what the reviewer would be looking for in this element. Do not change or remove anything here in the boilerplate. Also, a side note here, while I'm thinking of it, is that when you are creating your record review worksheet, make sure you're working off the most recent version of the template. So sometimes lead agencies, the states, they like to work off of their old worksheet from 3 years ago and just update it. And that's fine to use it as a starting point. But this template was revised a couple of years ago, so there were some changes to the boilerplate. There were some additions, the mid-table, element 500, and so on. So just a note to make sure that your submission matches the most recent, the current template. All right, still looking at element 100, column 1. Under the boilerplate right here is where you would add your policy citations or other requirements. Make sure that all of the applicable components from the boilerplate are included here. So you can see that in this example, the state has added policy citations for application, assets, and certificate. We're going to stick with element 100 and move on to the next part of customizing, which is column 2. Again, here you would add items to assist the reviewers in conducting a detailed analysis of the case record. So like in column 1, be sure that everything from the element's boilerplate that is applicable to your state is included. So you can see that in this example at the top, the lead agency has added an item asking whether there was a signed application in the case file, an item on eligibility notification, an item on assets, declarations, and an item on the child care certificate. Again, this will look different in your state, but hopefully this can give you an idea of what that customization might look like. A couple of other things to note in column 2. As you can see here for the assets item, there is an NA box, not applicable. And we do like to see those included when there's yes, no items, if that item might not be applicable to all scenarios. Also note the inclusion of a comments box here. And that's not a requirement to include that in your customization, but we do really highly recommend it because, you know, sometimes things aren't always captured by the items, the other items. So the comment box can be really helpful for reviewers. That's why it's recommended. Let's take a quick look at column 3. Again, like I stated a few minutes ago, column 3 is not actually customized. So you should not add any text to here. However, you could add a field, like a text field, especially if you're working in Microsoft Word, like a field for reviewers to enter their responses. That's fine, but the important thing is that it prints out blank. Finally, we'll take a look at column 4. Again, here you should not add or edit anything, although like in column 3, you can add response fields. So let's take a look at some column 1 and column 2 customizations for a couple of other elements. So here's element 200, which deals with priority group placement. So let's take a quick look at the boilerplate. Determine whether the client met criteria of a state designated priority group, for example, special needs or low income. So I wanted to talk about this element because it's one that we see does not apply in some states. So many states don't have a waiting list, so the priority group is not something that they would look for during eligibility. So this element is not always applicable. So if this is the case for your lead agency, we still ask that you customize column 1. You can, for example, include any policies that you do have about priorities or wait lists, even if you don't have an active wait list. For column 2 of element 200, it's the same thing. Even if this element does not apply in your state, we still ask that you add a customization here. Simply including a note that you do not have a wait list during the review period or the sample month would suffice here. So that was element 200. Now let's skip forward, take a look at element 400, financial requirements. The boilerplate description states that in this element, the reviewer will examine the client's income to make sure that it meets state requirements. And also, the reviewer will look at whether the copay assigned to the child under review was correct. So below the boilerplate, the lead agency here has added their customizations, the state rules and regulations that deal with financial requirements. Moving to column 2 in element 400, the lead agency has added a number of items that the reviewers will consider when determining whether the client met financial requirements. I won't go through each of these in detail, but all of the components from the boilerplate in column 1 are included here in column 2. There's items about household size, income verification, family share, the copay, and was the income below the SMI cutoff. And they've also added a comments box, which we always like to see. Actually, we have another good question that came in, and we might have to address this one following the webinar, but the question is, why is the asset question in element 100 instead of 400? And that's a really good question because, assets we think have to do with the family's financial situation, and that's covered in 400. So I'm going to actually turn this question over to our OCC friends as well to see if they have some insight on how it ended up like that.
Yeah, that's a really good question. This is Linda. The way it happened was originally 400 wasn't, I think it said income before we made the most recent changes to the DCI. So I think we've brought it's still focused only on income and not on assets. And assets really are different. One is money that's continually coming in, and the other is something that you own, like property. And assets are also dealt with very differently. Most states really do just ask a question like, can you state how much you have, or can you state that you don't have more than $1 million in assets? So it's really treated very differently, and that's why it seemed to be something that states were really just asking a question about or needed a specific form for. And because it was kind of almost like a loose end, we put it under 100 because it's a document. It ends up being a document that states just need to kind of check that they have. And it is very different, as I said, from income, and it's not going to impact the case the way income is going to, because you're not going to be doing calculations. You're probably not going to find errors in that one, because it's going to be very unusual to find someone that turned out to have $1 million. That just, that they reported that and the eligibility worker missed that somehow. So I think that's why it got such different treatment. But that's a great question. I hope that makes sense. That's part of the thinking that I think went into that, though.
Thanks, Linda. And thanks for the question, Carol. So in our final example here for the record review worksheet, final example for customizing the record review worksheet, I wanted to show element 410. 410, looking at the boilerplate, is where the reviewer compares the subsidy amount that they calculate to the subsidy amount authorized by the eligibility worker. If there's a discrepancy, then here's where they would examine the payment amount to determine whether there was an improper payment. So be sure to customize column 1 here, just as in the previous elements. If you worked on the Record Review Worksheet in previous cycles, this was not a requirement. I think a few years ago it was something that you could do, but you weren't required to, but now it is a requirement. So please add policies or any other instructions for reviewers on calculating authorizations, calculating payments, or determining improper payments. In column 2 of 410, we're really looking for a few specific things here, more so than in previous elements, where there's a lot more flexibility for states in their customizations. So we need to see a place to record the eligibility worker subsidy amount and the reviewer subsidy amount. And there should also be a place to record the difference, if there is one, and somewhere to record the sample month payment amount, if a difference was found between the two subsidy amounts. And a comment box is also always good to include. Some lead agencies do like to add other things here, and that's perfectly fine. What I'm showing here is kind of the minimum of what we like to see. Sometimes the lead agencies include items to record, like whether it was an over or underpayment, or there's additional guidance for calculating the subsidy amounts or things like that, and that's all fine. And just a quick thing to note here for column 4 of 410, again, you don't customize column 4, but I just wanted to point out that in the template, column 4 is a bit different from the previous elements. There's only 2 items here, whereas the other elements, there's also an item 2A. So be sure that when you're creating your record review worksheet that this matches the template. I mentioned earlier that in addition to columns 3 and 4 not being customized, the mid-table and element 500 are also not customized. And I don't have those included in the webinar slides, but I wanted to quick show you what they look like. So here's 400 and 410, we just looked at those. And then after that, we have the mid-table. And again, you should not change anything here. And then we have element 500, and you should not change anything here either. So this is not customized. All right, so we have a question that came in from Reginald in Florida. He asked, what information should we include in column 3? So Reginald, are you asking about what you should include in column 3 when you're creating your worksheet? Or are you asking about what information would the reviewers include when they're actually looking at the case records? Can you quick type that in? Both. Okay, no, that's fair enough. So when you are customizing column 3, sorry, that actually should be left blank. You shouldn't add anything there. So there should be no information. And I did say that you could add like a field, someplace to enter text, if that would be helpful, you know, for the reviewers when they're conducting the reviews. But in the actual printed version of your worksheet template, that should be blank. So column 3 should be empty. So when you're actually conducting reviews, column 3 is used to give kind of a brief summary of what the findings were for the element. So you would say, you know, if there's no error, you could just say there's no error, or if there was an error, then you give a brief summary of what was found. All right. So then we got another question in that's related to Reginald. In the results column, how are we indicating the results if we cannot modify the column? Okay, so that's a really good question, and I think there's we're dealing with kind of two separate things here. I think you're asking about, when you're conducting reviews, how can you indicate the results? Whereas I'm talking about, when you're customizing your worksheet, you should not be adding anything here. So again, you can add a space, a field, or something that can be used by the reviewers to enter the results, but you should not be adding any additional like text or words or anything here. When the reviews are being conducted after the worksheet has been approved, then you can, fill in, you'd be filling in, indicate your results. So at this point, we're just talking about before the reviews take place. All right, so in a printed version of the completed record review worksheet, column 3 should not have any information. Yeah, and that's correct. And this is, again, just referring to that template. So this is before any reviews take place, just the template on which you'll be conducting the reviews. Column 3 should not have any information. In a completed worksheet, when you've done a review, then yes, you would expect to see information there. And if Reginald or Eric, if you do have any follow-up questions, you can let us know either via email or in the evaluation following the webinar. All right, so we're almost to 4 o'clock Eastern, so I wanted to spend a couple of minutes on next steps. These are actually just some reminders. We already, I think, addressed these earlier in the webinar, but the last day for submitting your SDAP is October 31st of 2020. And the last day for submitting your customized record review worksheet is December 31st of 2020. And reviews cannot begin until that has been approved. And you are encouraged to send drafts of your SDAP and record review worksheet to your NCSIA error rate specialist for review before you submit them. You don't have to do that, but you are encouraged to do that so we can, take a quick look at them before you do your official submission. This slide just shows some other TA resources from NCSIA. We have a website that contains links to our previous webinars and some other information. Keep checking it because we will have some more resources posted in the future. And we will hope to hold another webinar for the Year 2 states sometime in the coming months in spring of 2020. But if you do, want to get started on your reviews and would like some TA, before then, definitely reach out to us. And I don't think there's any other questions that have come in, so we'll wrap it up now. Here's our contact information. Again, Janae is the specialist in Region 7, Leanne is in Region 1, and I'm the specialist for the other regions. Thank you very much for joining us. Again, there will be an evaluation that pops up, so please feel free to use that to, we'll share your thoughts on this webinar and request any follow-up TA. So again, thanks for joining us. And anyone else on the panel have any closing thoughts?
AD provided a link that maybe could be sent out to everyone, if that's helpful, that gives a definition of the pooling factor, gives a little bit more information.
Okay, great.
I wanted to mention that. I don't know if that could be sent out just for those who are interested in digging a little deeper on that.
Sure. Yeah, you can let us know in the evaluation or email us and we can send that link out. All right. Well, and I hope that all of you enjoyed the webinar, and please have a great rest of the day. Thank you.